Hello friends, with the year rapidly winding down, it is time for several annual videos that we do here across BookTube, looking back at the reading year we had, the books that stood out, our favorites, books that surprised us, books that let us down, as well as looking forward into next year, looking into 2026 at the books that we're excited to read, the books that we're anticipating. But of course, this video is all about the best 6 books that I read this year. Coming in at number 6 is In Late Summer by Magdalena Blažević, and this is a book that was not even on my radar. In fact, I'd never even heard about the publisher until someone mentioned them on YouTube. And when I was checking out the releases, In Late Summer stood out to me because it centers around the Bosnian War that happened in the 90s. And that interests me because we rarely see literature from Bosnia, Croatia, and the period of history of the dissolution of Yugoslavia just has captured my interest lately. And so I figured I would give this a shot. And this was the biggest probably surprise of the year for me just because of how much I enjoyed it. It's written with a very Morrison or Faulkner type of writing style that is terse but very dense, with emotion and poetic and rich lyrical writing style. But a little bit about the book: it's a collection of poignant vignettes told through the eyes of a 14-year-old girl named Ivana. She recalls the whimsical days of the summer, childlike games she would play, picking out strawberries with her friend Dunya, her brother, family, and the like. It's a very peaceful scene, and it's told through these very vivid, picturesque descriptions. And all of that constructs this atmosphere of peace, of bliss, of innocence, especially that of a child. And all of that is sharply contrasted once war arrives at their footsteps, once they hear the crunching of leaves underneath these black leather boots. And it's described perfectly in this quote: "The ear shatters from unknown sounds. It's clear that the creak on the stairs and the clang of metal are announcing death." And it's those just sharp sentences, very economical, that deliver such an evocative, sensation for readers. And so as I was reading the book, I felt drawn into the village as if I was hearing the same sounds, seeing the same sights, and feeling the same terror and fear with these troops and this war fast approaching. And then the other thing Blažević does masterfully in this work, beyond the contrast of the innocence of childhood and the bleak destruction of war, are the analogies that she draws. So at one point, there is a puddle of viscous red blood, and that is compared to the childhood memories of this sweet, viscous strawberry juice that is coming from the strawberries that they plucked in the field. And so there's this imagery that is drawn. There's another example where there's this mixture of shattered bones, blood, brains that makes her think of these kaleidoscopic hues and colors from her childhood. It's very vivid. It's a very harrowing story, and for that reason, it was number 6 on my list. Number 5 on my list is The Soviet Century by Karol Schlogel. This is an absolute must read if you're a Slavophile like me or have any interest in what life was like in the Soviet Union. Schlogel introduces you to the Soviet Union like no other author has before. It really has this essence of like walking into a museum, the way that you're overwhelmed with the senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the products they use, the cities that were constructed. Everything is depicted and explored with such great detail, from the famous perfume Krasnaya Moskva, the Magnitogorsk, this industrial city that was a powerhouse for the USSR, to prison tattoos, dachas, cooking books, Hrushchevkas, the Gulag. Schlogel leaves no stone unturned, and what's magnificent to me about it is he does it in a way that's isolating on these particular features, events, characteristics of the culture of the certain period of history, but also doing so in a way that is carrying this historic narrative, is carrying you through what life was like so that you can slowly piece things together and almost step into the diorama that he's creating. And what I also appreciate about the work is that it's not done in a very critical or sententious manner where it's looking through the USSR through a very Western or critical lens. And by doing so, it doesn't become this kind of cliche indictment or moral condemnation on the Soviet Union or on communism, but it really has this fresh and enlightening feel to it about looking into a different culture, a different way of life, a different time, basically. And that's why it's kind of described as an excavation or archaeology of a lost world, I believe is how he kind of describes the book and the project overall. And here's a quote that I think kind of captures what I mean. He says, quote, "We can complain about the delusions of earlier generations, but they did what they could with the means available to them at the time and with the expectations and hopes that fulfilled their lives. Whether we have truly surpassed them is unclear." I think that's a great way and a great perspective and attitude to go into studying Soviet history. is not just looking at all the things they did wrong and trying to construct this society that has never been seen before, trying to take a failed empire, turn it on its head within a few years, construct housing for the millions upon millions that are displaced or homeless, and also try to compete on a world scale and catch up to the industrial revolutions that Russia was severely behind and lacking in. That is something that is sometimes lost upon people that just look at the Soviet Union from a glance, and I think that a book like this really gives you the depth, the context, the historical kind of facts and references to really get a better understanding of why they lived like this, how they lived, that is rarely ever seen from the Western perspective. Now, the next few are sort of interchangeable, but I put at number 4, War and Peace by Lев Tolstoy. Now, there are few classics that I feel like are must-reads for everybody. And this is one of them. War and Peace is such an audacious project to me because it's not purely historical fiction. It's not purely this sprawling Russian epic. It of course is that, but it's also this masterful blend of philosophy, ideology, political discussion and commentary, as well as just simply a phenomenal tale, a phenomenal fictional tale with these immensely complicated and just enthralling characters. From the radiant Natasha to the daring Andrei Bolkonsky, Pierre Dolhov, and many others, Tolstoy is a virtuoso when it comes to constructing compelling characters. His characters just leap off the page and come alive in ways that few authors are able to achieve. And all of this is set within the tumultuous, iconic backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars, which is fascinating in its own right. But then once you look at the blend between Russian and French cultures, especially the influence of French culture and French language on Russian society, on Russian nobility, it becomes it just amplifies how compelling this novel is. And so Tolstoy takes you through these extravagant Russian balls, these striking war scenes, contentious affairs and exchanges between characters. Naturally, there's going to be a Russian duel in there as well. And it really captures an entire era, and you feel like you are living within the era. And it does exactly what an epic is supposed to do, and it really achieves it on epic proportions, no pun intended there. And on top of that, within the book, paced in an adequate way, Tolstoy basically adds in these philosophical essays or inquiries into fate, free will, war, nationhood, patriotism, cultural identity, language even to some extent. All of this is kind of spliced within it, especially the epilogue to me is sort of like a novella or philosophical treatise kind of just added at the end. But it's just a perfect work. I mean, it really is one of the greatest novels, if not the greatest novel ever written. And it's the kind of book that you can read over and over and over again and get something different each time, enjoy it each time, if not enjoy it even more than the previous. Moving on to number 3 is The Recognitions by William Gaddis. Now, this is a book that a lot of people will justifiably give up on, for various reasons. One, the writing style is simply jarring and disorienting. I think that works in its favor for me personally and for a lot of readers that love the book, but for others it's just going to be simply frustrating, confusing because of the unattributed dialogue, because of the kind of jumping around, because of the polyphonic and almost discordant or scattered flow of the book. But for me, I found it thrilling, particularly because those party scenes, which I believe there's 3 of them in the book, just feel like nothing I've ever read before. They just draw you right into the story. I was telling my book club about this while we were reading it, it felt like I was in some kind of Hollywood movie where I was, in the basically point of view of the camera and being thrust around the room into each conversation, jumping around the room. Like, that's the kind of cinematography I was imagining in my head. And to me, it's marvelous to be able to achieve something like that through written language, through physical text like that. And so for that alone, it was a book that stood out to me. But on top of that, the themes of the story are just brilliant. First of all, Gaddis is looking at American fakery, plagiarism, money, all of these things. Money, of course, is what he explores more so in JR, but there's some of that here. But particularly, he's looking at what it means to create authentically, what it means for a work of art to contain recognitions, to contain human expression, human creativity, human originality, or just originality, I should say, overall, and authenticity. Because you're following this character, son of a Calvinist priest, named Wyatt. And Wyatt is a brilliant painter, but instead of creating original works, he spends his time creating forgeries, copying the style of Flemish painters. Now it gets a little bit tricky because although he's copying the style of some other painter, is he still creating some piece of original work? Is he still imbuing the piece of artwork with human expression, human creation, with some sort of recognitions? And one of the other fascinating characters is Otto, who is writing this play, and a lot of the parts of the play he is either being inspired by something else, or he is literally taking some conversation he had with someone in real life, putting it into the play. And funny enough, once he actually is sharing his play with other people, they think he's plagiarized it. They think he's a fraud. And so it really makes you question, these amongst other situations and characters within the story, make you question, where is the line between originality and forgery, between plagiarism and authenticity? And you notice that there's a lot of gray area between that. For example, if William Gaddis himself writes this novel, but a lot of the components are inspired by James Joyce's Ulysses, as they supposedly were, or other stories, and who inspired James Joyce, it kind of goes back indefinitely on the different levels of inspiration. And at what point again does it become something original? Now, why I found the story, another reason why I found the story so infinitely interesting is because of our current conundrum with AI art and AI music and all sorts of artificially created forms of art. And it makes me wonder, what does it mean for something to be original? Is it inherently better because it's made by a human? And if so, why? Why do we prefer man-made art? Why do we prefer something that was created from some sort of original inspiration or from some, vivid experience or idea from a human being, rather than knowing it was created by a computer or some sort of software? And I wrote about this on a Substack, and I don't want to spoil the story either, although the novel overall is open for all sorts of interpretation. It's very ambiguous, but I absolutely loved it. A lot of people in the book club gave up on it. A lot of people never started it, but the people that did finish loved it, and all said, myself included, that it's probably the book I thought about most this year after finishing. It's just something that kept coming to my mind and something I'll definitely reread in the future. And next year, I'll be reading J.R. by William Gaddis, and I can't wait to dig into this. Number 2 on my list was a reread for me, and that was Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a book that demands a reread and rewards it. The first time I read this book, I was so confused between the Russian diminutives, the historical, ideological, and religious references, and even the plot overall. I was following the plot, but it just didn't hit, I guess, in the way that it really connected with me. However, the ending was it left such a strong impression on me. It was such a just shocking, frenzy, and furious ending that I knew I had to return to this. And I'm so glad I took the time, and of course with my own personal studying of Russian language, history, culture, all of that, I came back to this book fully prepared, fully equipped, not to necessarily grasp everything from it, squeeze all the juice out of it, but I certainly got a lot more glasses of juice than I did the first time around, and loved it way more than even the first time, which is saying something. To generalize this book and put it into a nutshell, this story is an exposition on what happens to a Russian town when it's corrupted by socialist revolutionaries, when it descends and spirals down into a godless, moralist, and utterly depraved society. But just like all great novels, especially those written by Dostoevsky, there's a lot more going on here within the subtext, philosophically, ideologically, and even psychologically. And that's one thing that stands out to me about this book, even more than the Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, Crime and Punishment, is the psychological depth of several characters in this book, but particularly Nikolai Severogin. I find him to be the most intriguing character that Dostoevsky has ever written, and honestly of most Russian characters that I've ever read. Primarily because he doesn't just adopt this predictable, bland, cliche, nihilist approach. He goes much further than that, and he really exemplifies what happens when society or a particular individual becomes so bereft of belief, so bereft of ideals, morals, ethics, and it's not simply a fact of not believing in God or not believing in traditions and kind of just disregarding let's say, some of the foundations of society. But it goes even further beyond that because he can't even believe that he doesn't believe. There's this void of belief and passion that really makes Nikolai Stavrogin like the antithesis of life, this absolute negation. But even that, you know, he's unable to have or believe in or act in accordance with any sort of absolutes or beliefs. So for that reason, he's very intriguing. I made a long video dissecting this book that you can find on the channel if you're curious. But this book is just phenomenal. Like I said, it's a blend of kind of similar to War and Peace, but a much more isolated, localized, and also more recent period of history that looks at revolutionary ideologies pre-Bolshevik Revolution that were happening within the 1860s, 70s, which is when this book was written, and that carried on and inspired the revolutionary movements that shaped and permanently altered Russia in the 20th century. And that's why this book a lot of people view as prophetic, but I also just view it as prescient more broadly. I think it really shows what happens when a society is kind of led by an aimless, massive, and just quite honestly justified dissident group, and how they can be easily manipulated by some bombastic leader, whether it's a politician or, you know, these days some influencer, whatever kind of figure it is. Some charlatan comes about, takes these justifiably angry and dissident social movements and groups and exploits them, leads them down a path that just leads to absolute destruction, that dismantles authority, that dismantles trust, and creates absolute mayhem, chaos, riots, murder, all of that. I think that's something we see in America. We've seen several kind of waves of it. We see it in other countries. We see it in Europe. We see it within Russia, of course, with the Bolshevik Revolution and others. So it's just, it's something that I think is cyclical within human nature, and that's why it's a classic. That's why it remains relevant, and I think that's what makes Dostoevsky such a special psychologist, is not just what he saw within particular characters like Nikolai Stavrogin on the individual level, but also of humanity overall. And the best book I read in 2025 was Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. This is a sprawling Russian epic that really feels like a modern-day War and Peace. Just like War and Peace, it also features an extensive cast of characters, each rendered with profound depth, personality, trials and tribulations, and what it does masterfully is it immerses you within the perspective of several characters simultaneously. So sometimes you're on the war front, getting absolutely shelled by Nazi soldiers. Another time you're in the Lubyanka, being imprisoned by the same country you sought to defend. And then you pivot to Viktor Sturm, which is this physicist very much written in the likeness of Vasily Grossman himself, who is constantly under the pressure, the fear, and the threat of censorship, and even being purged by the Soviet authoritarian regime. And then you have several other characters, women and children, dealing with these fractured families that are split all across Russia, correspondences that are left unanswered. They have no clue what happened. You're following soldiers within prisoner of war camps, and it's really a novel that I think probes into the moral ambiguities of war. And by doing so, it doesn't vindicate the brutal, murderous authoritarian regimes of Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, but what it does force you to do is think deeper about the role, the choices, the free will contained within the soldiers and the civilians of these different warring nations. And just like War and Peace, there's several chapters that can almost serve as essays, that they could kind of be extracted from the novel as just an exploration, an inquiry into the nature of goodness or evil, into the nature of fate and free will, or war more broadly. For example, this one quote here is beautiful. "But what is good? It used to be said that it is a thought and a related action which led to the greater strength or triumph of humanity, or of a family, nation, state, class, or faith. People struggling for their particular good always attempt to dress it up as a universal good. They say, my good coincides with the universal good. My good is essential not only to me, but to everyone. In achieving my good, I serve the universal good." And here's the key part. "And so, the good of a sect, class, nation, or state assumes a specious universality in order to justify its struggle against an apparent evil." And that to me is the danger with this kind of reductionist view of wars and matters in the world as good and evil. It's not that you can't objectify evil or wrongdoing in some way. You can, but what it does is it opens up the room for some kind of charismatic leader or some nation, sect, group, class to position themselves as part or one in the same with some kind of universal good, some good of humanity. And if they can take the role of the good, everything opposed to them is evil, and they can justify and rationalize murdering, genocide, etc. And on top of that, what this book really made me reflect on is the role of free will, which is also something explored by Tolstoy in War and Peace, but in my opinion, he comes to slightly different conclusions, whereas Grossman here it uses this great analogy of the waves at sea. He says, quote, "Yes, if the sea was able to think, then every storm would make its waters dream of happiness. Each wave breaking against the cliff would believe it was dying for the good of the sea. It would never occur to it that, like thousands of waves before and after, it had only been brought into being by the wind." And then one more quote that blends perfectly with that is where he says, "A man may be led by fate, but he can refuse to follow." So in my eyes, different than Tolstoy, he kind of acknowledges that there is a chance. Like the threads of fate, the wheels of life will carry you in certain directions in life. They will force you to the front line. They may force you to kind of capitulate or go along with a potentially brutal or oppressive regime or authorities. But there is that opportunity to resist fate. Fate may carry you to a certain position. It may carry you to a certain door, but you can choose to not open that door. You can choose to not place your hand on that knob. At least that's what Grossman posits and suggests within this story. So overall, it's a phenomenal book. I could not recommend this novel more. And I plan to read Stalingrad, which is the prequel to this as well. And then who knows, maybe I'll reread this sooner than I think. But Grossman was definitely one of the authors that stood out to me this year. So that is it. Those are the best 6 books I read in 2025. Now, if you want the list of the best 10 books I read this year, I wrote about that on my Substack, which I'll link down below. But let me know in the comments, what is the best book? Or, I'll open it up. Give me a few of the greatest books you read this year in the comment section down below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more content, and I will see you all in the next one.